Good afternoon and welcome to the final Melbourne Institute Colloquium for 2020. My name is Roger Wilkins and I'm the Deputy Director of the Melbourne Institute. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. These colloquia replace our normal face-to-face forums and workshops. Our goal is to provide insights through the lens of Melbourne Institute researchers and to engage with you, the audience, so we can better understand Australian economic and social policy issues. Today, Professor Abigail Payne and Dr. Maxim Ananyev will present findings from their report, Measuring Individual Poverty, Correlates and Variations over Time, which was produced as part of the Breaking Down Barriers report series in partnership with the Paul Ramsay Foundation. About our speakers, Professor Abigail Payne is the Director of the Melbourne Institute and the Ronald Henderson Professor. Professor Payne's research has emphasised understanding the challenges faced by charities in their funding and delivery of public goods and services, including understanding donor motivations. Her research also examines the opportunities and constraints for individuals to pursue higher educational attainment, the role of school financing to promote equality in opportunity, and how government policy and expenditures affect individuals, communities, and underserved populations. More recently, Professor Payne has turned her attention to understanding poverty and disadvantage. She has embarked on several projects that explore community poverty, the factors that support exit from disadvantage, and the cyclical nature of poverty and disadvantage within households. Dr. Maxim Ananyev is a research fellow at the Melbourne Institute and holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. He applies methods of computational social science to the issues of economic deprivation, discrimination, social capital, and political economy. His research has been published in peer-reviewed outlets and presented at various professional conferences in the disciplines of economics, political science, demography, and computer science. At the Melbourne Institute, Dr. Ananyev works on several projects that use census data, tax records data, and health-related records data to measure inequality, poverty, and the impact of policy changes on the lives of Australians. So Abigail and Maxim will speak for approximately 30 minutes, followed by which we'll have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. A note about how we are handling questions and comments. For those of you watching through Zoom, we're relying on the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. For those of you watching through Slido, you can submit questions in the box at the right-hand side of your screen. You can submit questions at any time through these functions, and then I will relay those questions to our speakers during the Q&A. With that, I'd now like to invite Abigail and Maxim to speak.
Great, thank you very much, Roger. Let me just share my screen. And welcome to everyone who is joining us. I am thrilled. Roger, can you just make sure that you're seeing the slides for me? Yes.
Yes, all good, all good.
Good, thank you. So I'm thrilled to be presenting with my colleague Maxim, as well as, while he's not part of the presentation, my other colleague Rajiv Samaraj, this third report in our Breaking Down Barriers series. And let me kind of remind you what the Breaking Down Barriers report series is about. So this is a new area that we've been getting into in collaboration with the Paul Ramsay Foundation to kind of build on our foundations of understanding disadvantage and persistent and entrenched poverty. As you will recall, the first report, we focused on intergenerational disadvantage, and we focused on trying to understand using HILDA data, whether individuals that experience disadvantage as a child are likely to experience disadvantage as a young adult. And unfortunately, we do find a very strong positive correlation between the years of disadvantage as a child and outcomes as a young adult. In the second report, which we presented a few weeks ago, we focused on measuring community poverty. So not just relying on an Australian-wide poverty rate, but trying to dig into deeper into communities to understand where is there variation. So we find communities that cycle in and out of poverty, as well as the rates of poverty that we're observing over time. So this third report, which you are focusing on today, is taking that community report a step further. What do we know about individuals? What do we know about households? And we're going to be relying on the longitudinal census data to explore this. So really the aim of the report, and I'm going to encourage you to read the report because we're only going to touch on a little bit of it today, is a very detailed and rich description of the dynamics of relative income poverty at an individual and household level. So what we study, we're going to group by characteristics, age and family composition. So what do we observe in terms of poverty rates based on your age profile, based on the family composition. We then look at educational attainment, employment characteristics. Are you in the labor force, out of the labor force, employed, part-time, full-time, or unemployed? We look at place of birth as well as your indigenous status in terms of poverty rates. And then what we think is really the novelty of this report is that we start looking at the dynamics. And what we mean by dynamics is to what extent do we observe you flowing in and out of poverty, or do we observe you actually getting into poverty and never leaving? Or what are the factors that can affect your exiting poverty? So we're going to study who moves into poverty, who moves out, as well as the level of persistence of poverties. And in terms of persistence, we're really thinking about, do people cycle in and out of poverty? Finally, we touch on a little bit, we bring back the notion of community level poverty rates and try to observe to what extent do we see individual poverty rates being a reflection of what's happening in the community. Let me, for this next stage, let me turn the microphone over to my colleague Maxime, who is going to walk through the data and some of the preliminary analysis.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks, Abigail and Roger. So let me briefly talk about the data. We use a fascinating data set called Australian longitudinal census data. It has been constructed in the following way. The ABS took 5% of census records from 2006 and linked them through 2011 census to the 2016. Next slide, please. This means that we can follow the same people for 10 years with a 3 snapshot of their census information. Of course, there is attrition. Some people move out of the country, some people die, some neglect to submit the census form. But the value of the data is that we still can follow 357,610 people over 3 census years, with information about the income, place of residence, family structure, and other important variables. So our main focus here is relative income poverty. Following our previous work on this issue, we classify a person as being in poverty if their household income is less than 60% of median income for that year, adjusted for household size. This means basically that larger families need higher incomes to be classified as not in poverty. Here you can see some of the exact numbers that we used, but more technical details are provided in the report if you are interested. So let's move to our main findings. First, if we look at poverty rates within various groups, we find persistent correlations. Every single year, the same groups will be more likely to be in poverty than other groups. For example, of all family types, single parents consistently have the highest poverty rates. Another persistent gap. If we classify individuals based on their place of birth and indigenous status, we find that indigenous Australians have poverty rate twice as high as that of non-indigenous Australian-born individuals. Secondly, and here is where the longitudinal data becomes really important, we can look at people in poverty in 2016 and ask how many of them have been in poverty before and how many of them are newly poor. When we do this, when we ask this question, we find something close to a 50-50 split. 44% are newly poor, and 56% of those in poverty in 2016 have been in poverty before. The next logical question here is, what are the main differences between people who move out of poverty and people who stay in poverty? Or the people who move into poverty and people who stay out of poverty? What can explain these changes? We find, quite intuitively, education and work to be the most important differences. Out of people who move out of poverty, we see a high proportion of those who gain either education or work. And the same for people who manage to stay out of poverty. Finally, we look at the community level. Do people in places where the aggregate poverty level is persistently high find it harder to move out of poverty? The answer is yes, they do. Community here is defined as statistical area too, basically a neighborhood where you live. Please read our previous report if you're interested in the dynamics of the community level poverty rates. Now, let's look at the analysis of the groups in a bit more detail. First, let's explore different types of families. We classify families into 4 categories: singles, single parents, couple households, and couple households with children. In our sample, singles, couple households, and couple households with children each constitute close to 1/3 of the data. The smallest group is single parents, only 4% of the sample. This is data for 2016. Things are similar in the previous years. If, however, we take people who are in poverty in 2016 and look at the distribution of family types among them, then the distribution is different. Now 12% of the sample are single parents. The percentage much larger than their share in the whole sample. In the report, we calculate another important measure that we call entrenchment rate. It is a proportion of people who are in poverty for more than 2 census years out of those who are in poverty in at least one of the census years. Intuitively, it measures, if you are already in poverty, how difficult it is for you to move out of poverty. Here you see entrenchment rates for different family types. For none of the family types, it is lower than 30%, but for single parents, it is the highest, almost 50%. This means roughly that if you are a single parent in poverty, there is 50% chance that you will stay that way. This is a relatively high level of entrenchment. Now let's look at other groupings. For example, education. Out of all educational levels, the highest level of poverty is recorded among those who did not finish high school. It is also worth noting that their poverty rate increased the most by 2011 and they dropped by 2016. The increase in poverty by 2011 is most likely explained by the effects of the global financial crisis. These rapid changes in poverty rate might mean that, this group, people who did not finish high school, is the most vulnerable to aggregate economic fluctuations. Let's look at 2 other educational categories: high school graduates and post-high school certificate holders, basically people with vocational training. Their poverty rates are lower and they fluctuate less. What is surprising for us here is that the poverty rates among post-high school certificate holders are not that much lower than the poverty rate among high school graduates. We find it somewhat unexpected, given how important vocational training is. Finally, the poverty rate is the lowest among people with university degrees. It also fluctuates the least. Still, we find 5–6% of people in this category to be in poverty. Overall, we see quite intuitive picture. Higher levels of formal training correspond to lower levels of poverty. Now let's look at another important categorization, the one based on place of birth and indigenous status. Indigenous Australians have the rate of poverty twice as high as that of non-Indigenous Australia-born individuals, and this gap is persistent. What was surprising for us is that foreign-born individuals have much higher level of poverty than non-Indigenous Australian-born persons. Entrenchment rates are also important here. 35% for non-Indigenous Australian-born persons and more than 40% for Indigenous and foreign-born persons. Again, these are very high levels of entrenchment. In conclusion to this part of the report, I should say that while these facts describe the situation with poverty in Australia, correlations here do not necessarily imply causation. We should be cognizant of interconnected structural reasons behind those numbers. Now, Abigail will talk more about the dynamics of poverty.
Great, thank you, Maxime. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start digging into the details of the data. So the richness of the ACLD data is the fact that we can measure poverty for the same individual over 3 periods, the 3 census years. So let me first start with the people that we observe in poverty in 2016. How long did we observe them in poverty? So in 2016, of our sample, approximately 44,000 are observed in poverty. And what you'll see is that the 44.5% of these were not observed in poverty in 2006 or 2011. So they newly moved into poverty. But if you will see that there's approximately 44% of these people were in poverty in 2011, and approximately 32% were observed in poverty in 2006. Now, if we look at those that were not in poverty, obviously our vast majority of the individuals are not in poverty. That's 313,000. You'll see that only close to 80% of them were not observed in poverty in 2006 or 2011. So we have about 20% of the population that moved out of poverty by 2016 from the prior years. Now to illustrate in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to pull this apart for you, is what I'm demonstrating to you is what we call Sankey diagram. So what a Sankey diagram allows us to do is that we can actually plot every single individual in our sample on a figure and then demonstrate the flow of poverty or the flow of their income over the 3 sample periods. So along the vertical axis at the bottom will be those individuals whose incomes are less than median household income. And those at the top of the figure will be those whose incomes are higher than the median household income. And then you will see lines for 2006, 2011, and 2016. Now, let me pull this pretty figure apart a little bit for you. Let's first talk about those who are moving into poverty, either from 2006 to 2011, or those that move from 2011 to 2016. What you can see in this first set of transitions is that there's actually a fair number of people that move into poverty, and they're not necessarily people who are just above the line. So it's, a good portion were just above our poverty line, which demonstrates the relative magnitude of what we're looking at. But there's a decent number that actually were well above the line that are moving into poverty. And it's this type of figure that should be making us scratch our heads and say, what's going on here? What's caused these people to fall into an income level that is below 60% of the median income? Moving next, let's take the more optimistic story of who moves out of poverty. So what the green line is demonstrating is the flow from 2006 to 2011, and again from 2011 to 2016, of the individuals that move out. And what you can see is that a good proportion of those that moved out of poverty between 2006 and 2011 remained out and actually continued to increase their incomes. And they increase their incomes substantially. And that we have a smaller proportion that moved out of poverty between 2011 and 2016. Moving next, this is demonstrating what we're going to call the cycles in and out of poverty, where you can see the individuals that moved into poverty between 2006 and 2011 and then moved back out, and then vice versa, those who moved out of poverty between 2006 and 2011 and then moved back in. So, this figure is to us is quite informative in that it really illustrates the importance of not thinking of poverty like you might a medical condition. You know, if I break my leg, we pretty much know what to do. I need to wear a cast, I need to rest. There's a whole set of characteristics I should be following. But when it comes to poverty, whether it's catching people before they move in or helping and supporting people to move out of poverty, it's multifaceted. It's going to involve a lot of characteristics, some of which we're studying in this report, and some of which we can't study because of the nature of the census data or the nature of a quantitative analysis. Let's continue on and look at the flow of poverty in a little bit more. So here what we're doing is that we're going to show you the flows of people that move into and out of poverty, and we're going to start demonstrating some of the correlations with characteristics we can observe in the census data. So what you will see is if you start at the top of the figure in 2006, you will see 14.5% of our sample were identified as being in poverty, and they're identified as being in red. By 2011, of that group, approximately 50% of those people moved out of being classified as being in poverty. And then you can see the further flow from 2011 to 2016. Now, let me start demonstrating what happens as we move along. So if we look at the arm of the individuals who started out in poverty in 2006, but then flowed out of poverty by 2011, what we observe is that 13% of these improve their educational attainment. And by improving educational attainment, this could be that they move from not having a high school degree to having a high school degree. Could be that they got vocational training or that they went on and got a bachelor's or higher degree. What you will also see is that approximately 24% of these individuals change their employment status to a better outcome. So it could be going from unemployment to employment. It could be going from part-time employment to full-time employment. But that 10% of these, even though they moved out of poverty, had a decline in their employment. Now, if we compare this to what happens from 2011 to 2016, what you will see is that those that moved out, approximately 82%, continue to stay out, whereas 17.6% move back into poverty. And what we're illustrating here is that we are seeing a positive correlation in terms of slightly higher educational attainments by those who move out of poverty versus those that move back into poverty, as well as some better employment outcomes for these individuals. Now, let's look at the individuals that were in poverty in 2006 and remained in poverty. What we observe is that in terms of their educational, there are some that did improve their education. There are some that did improve their employment circumstances, and some whose employment circumstances fell from 2006. But what you can see is that these numbers are lower in magnitude than what we observed for the previous group. And then if we look at these individuals, we will see only 65% of these individuals moved out of poverty by 2016. Here, the correlations with educational attainment as well as employment rates is less clear for this group, which suggests a serious need for investigating this further. Next, we move into the individuals that were not in poverty in 2006, but moved into poverty in 2011. What we can see is that there are lower magnitudes around educational attainment, lower magnitudes around improved employment circumstances, and a much substantial decrease in employment opportunities or employment attainment. And then if you look at those who moved in and out in 2016, again, slight improvements, but again, not major changes on the educational attainment in terms of the differences between those that stay in poverty versus those that move out of poverty. But we do see bigger differences around improved employment circumstances. And then finally, if we look at those who remain out of poverty in 2006, 2011, and that most of these remain out of poverty in 2016, But if we look at what's going on, while we see improvements in educational attainment, improvements in employment outcomes, we also see some negative employment outcomes, as well as a much bigger shock to the employment in 2016 for those that move into poverty. Now, in the report, we look at other correlates, such as changes in family status, the aging of the population, and a few other characteristics. We also look at differences across men and women in these figures. So putting it all together, what we think that this figure helps to demonstrate is there is an importance that education plays, and there is an importance in terms of providing better employment opportunities. So if we summarize things, is that what we're finding is that the dynamics of poverty we think is important, that we shouldn't just rely on a single snapshot for a given individual or household to figure out how do we best come up with policy and better practices for moving out of poverty, that we do find that many individuals cycle in and out of poverty, and that we think we've demonstrated that there are important correlations between education and employment for moving out of poverty. Now, additional things you're going to find in our report, if you look at it, is that we're going to look at additional statistics around age, employment conditions, and gender. Generally, what we find across the board is that women have higher rates of poverty than men across all ages and across all educational categories, except for those that obtain university degrees or higher. We also look at subgroups within education and employment, and we also look at foreign-born individuals, and we actually demonstrate that there's some very different outcomes for foreign-born individuals relative to Australian-born individuals or relative to Indigenous individuals. And then in terms of community and entrenchment, we've just hit the tip of the iceberg on this analysis, but essentially, not too surprisingly, we find that individuals and communities that have persistently high poverty rates also have lower chances of moving out of poverty over the sample period. Now, there is a lot more, and so I encourage you to look at the report. But the questions I'm getting asked right now is, what does this mean for our post-pandemic environment? And so we're going to introduce some other analysis we've been doing for other reports, just to give you a highlight. So what we know is that if you look at the impact of the Great Financial Crisis, which was in 2007, 2008, overall for Australia, it was relatively muted. We did not see the same effects as other countries. However, when you look at poverty, we did observe increased poverty rates in 2011 that we do attribute to the impact of the Great Financial Crisis. So what does that mean for the COVID-19 pandemic? Our concern is that if we don't take action, we don't introduce bold policies, continue to support those at the lower end of incomes, we could have bigger implications in terms of the poverty rates. So using data from our Taking the Pulse of the Nation survey that we've been undertaking since April, we linked our survey respondents to communities. Instead of, in our earlier report, we used an SA2. For the Taking the Pulse of the Nation survey, we needed to use SA4, which is basically the geography as kind of the local labor market region for the area. And then we grouped our communities into 4 quartiles based on the poverty rates we observed in 2016. Essentially what you're going to see is that this is for the highest poverty areas, but I can tell you it's a similar picture regardless of poverty rates for the communities. If you compare the 2016 statistics around employment rates versus what we observe in June to August this year or September to November this year, you will see, not too surprisingly, everyone knows this, we have higher unemployment rates, and we also have a higher proportion of the population reporting that they are working part-time instead of full-time. We then look at a measure of reported financial stress, and this is a question we asked in our survey. Basically, can you make ends meet? Are you having a hard time paying for your housing, paying for your critical essential goods and services? And what you see is that the bar on the right-hand side is for the quartile of communities that have the highest level of poverty rates, is that you see higher levels of stress being reported. And that includes just making ends meet. So we find this disturbing in that if you're just making ends meet, we know that in the policy today, we have JobKeeper, we have Job Seeker, the government has really stepped up to help support individuals and families. We really need to keep an eye on this. Moving into 2021, as a government, will need to pull back on some of its support. The other disturbing part we have on the survey, and we go into this in more detail in our next report, which will be issued tomorrow, is that we find that communities with the highest poverty rates, financial stress is not just reported by those who are unemployed, working part-time, or not in the labor force, but for our highest communities, we find that the highest level of stress is reported by those who are employed full-time. This obviously needs a lot more work and a lot more study, but these are warning signs that we have to be really keeping our eye on the ball if we really want to make sure that we are addressing the issues around poverty and helping those poverty rates to decline. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully this has generated a lot of questions by you, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Great, thanks, Abigail. So now we're moving into the where we can take questions from the audience. So just a reminder that you can submit those through the Q&A function in Zoom or through the box at the side on Slido. Just to begin with, I suppose a clarifying question. You're looking at individuals, and so that when you talk about education and employment, you're looking at the educational attainment and the employment of that individual, and as opposed to, say, for example, that the traits of the household in which they live, the people, you're not looking at employment levels within the household. Is that correct?
That is correct. So we for what the census data allows us to do is look at the individual, and then we know the composition of the family and the household for that individual. So we can use household income to create our measure of poverty. So whether or not that individual is part of a household that is poverty, but then we are able, when we focus on employment, gender, education, all of that is for the individual that is in the sample that we can study.
Did you look at how household composition changes were related to movements in and out of poverty? I guess you might expect that if someone is in a couple family with children and then becomes a single parent, given what you were showing at the start, that would be another driver. Is that something you looked at?
So in the report, we do look at whether or not your family composition changed. So we will start with you as saying, what kind of family are you in, and then if we observe you moving into poverty, do we observe a change in family circumstances? And it's certainly the case. There's a mechanical aspect that if there are, just take a simple case of a couple that are both working, and then they separate, then you go from 2 incomes to 1 income. So there is that potential mechanical aspect that could drive you into poverty because you no longer have that second income. But we are looking at family circumstances. I do want to be careful though, because what we don't want to be advocating are marriage policies to drive down poverty.
No. So now we do have a question about the regional effects that you were talking about. So there was, I think, Maxime, you were showing that living in a community with higher rates of poverty made it harder for you to escape poverty, that the entrenchment rates were higher for those communities. And there are, I guess, a bunch of questions that arise from that about to what extent that is an effect of the local, there's a causal effect of your local community on your likelihood of exiting poverty versus, being reflecting other factors driving the persistent disadvantage. And one specific question from John Freeban is, do you still find that regional effects are still significant drivers if you correct for educational attainment? And if yes, what are these regional effects? What do you think is driving it?
So Maxime, you may have a response, but what I'm going to say is that what we don't do is we don't start running regressions at this stage. But if you look at our other report where we use a pretty finely tuned definition of communities, and we look at educational attainment, while there is going to be a correlation between educational attainment and regional poverty, it's not, we observe poverty and even in areas with high levels of education. So it's not simply the case of living in the middle of nowhere, no one having an education and no jobs being available that drives up the poverty rate. We're observing poverty kind of regardless of education and employment opportunities. Maxine, did you want to add to that?
Well, I think this is correct. I also want to say that one of the things that we observe in the data is that even though education, especially higher education, seem to be a plausible pathway out of poverty, not many people who are in poverty and have lower levels of education, they move to the category with higher level of education. So this might speak to a situation where educational opportunities might not be available for some of the individuals in those communities. This is, I think, this area, I think, requires further exploration.
Yeah, let me add one more point to this, because one of the things we were perplexed about is, or thinking about, is this notion of what's the role of getting a better job or switching from part-time to full-time employment versus getting greater education. One of the things we need to be careful about is that, it's you get a better job or you get a different job. That's a relatively quick activity. Whereas you go out and you get more training, you get a certificate, you still need to build up experience. And so the temporal aspects in terms of what's the effect of more education on improving your circumstances is not going to necessarily be instantaneous. So we need to add in that temporal dimension and reflect on that when we're thinking about what are pathways out of poverty.
I think this regional or locational issue is a really interesting one that I would certainly like to see probed a lot further. And we've got another question coming through about the role of people. Well, they use the term internal migration, but I guess to what extent is moving to a more advantaged region associated with moving out of poverty and moving into a more disadvantaged region, and I guess trying to probe a bit further about what's causing what. Did you look at that issue at all in this report, or is there any? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I do have thoughts on it. So it's an excellent question, and it's an excellent point that is worthy of study. So I'm going to go back to one of the challenges we had when we looked at community level is that the census question asks, were you in the same house previously? It doesn't say, did you move to another, did you move geographic locations? Now with the ACLD data or the longitudinal data, we think we can get at this question of if they're moving, have they, where have they moved? Have they moved out of a region? Have they moved into another region? And we haven't for this report looked into this, but this is definitely an area we do want to be looking in into further. There's also, projects underway where we're using some other data that is actually, we're going to be able to measure income at an annual basis, going back to 1990, and we're going to be looking at geographic movements as well. So I think migration is understudied in Australia, and in part it's due to the challenges of what data would allow us to do that.
So there is another question that I think, I guess, is raising a concern with the data quality, perhaps. So the question specifically is, how confident are you that the measure of family income includes all sources of income? And I suppose that the question would be, the concern might be that individuals are sort of required to add it all up themselves. And while the census does tell them everything to include, do we have any sense of how good an income measure this is?
So again, it's another very good point, and underlying any study, not just our studies, underlying any study that tries to measure poverty is, how do you measure income, and is it just income, or are there other factors you should be bringing in? And there's not a single answer there. So what we can do with the census data is that we have to rely on their report of income, and it is grouped together. Roger, as someone who knows the HILDA survey intimately, that one of the values of HILDA is that you can break apart income, and we can test what's going on. If we are looking at tax filer data, which is what our next study is embarking on, what gets reported on an income tax, we'd like to think is going to be credible, because if you're not truthful, you could be subject to an audit, but they're all going to have weaknesses in the measures. The value of the linked census data is the fact that we can see 5-year snapshots. We can measure things like, what they report around their educational attainment, their income, their age, and so it's the combination of the figures.
Yeah, and you can generate a household income measure, which with the tax records is very difficult to do at present, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there is value in what we have done. Is it perfect? No, but I think there is strong enough value in what we have done to help inform policy and practice on where we should be going.
Yeah. Well, obviously I'm biased, but I think this is a really interesting use of this Australian Census longitudinal data set. I think I'm sure there are others working with it, but I haven't actually seen a lot, and I think this is really starting to show some of the potential of that longitudinal linkage. Did you have any reflections on having, particularly perhaps Maxime, working with this data on just what its potential is, just sort of taking you a bit outside perhaps what you've done, and thinking a bit more about where you'd like to go. What sort of potential? What do you think? Perhaps some of the limitations that are there potential ways it could be improved, given what we know about how the census is collected?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I think it's an incredibly important question, and this is a really fascinating source of data that can be used for many different questions, regardless regarding poverty, opportunities, and things like that. Specifically, as I mentioned previously, one of the puzzling facts that came from our analysis is that people with vocational training and people with just high school degrees do not seem to have very different poverty rates. And one of the things that might be happening here now, I'm just speculating. I should say, but But what might be happening is something that people have noticed in other countries and in Australia as well, as which is a disappearance of so-called middle skill jobs. So jobs polarization, and the polarization of jobs can be happening on the regional level and at the level and on the level of the Australia as a whole. And this is something that I think can be very fruitfully explored with this data, because we know incomes of people, we know where they live, we know what happens in their areas economically. This, I think, is one of the plausible future projects with this data. I think there is also a great value in combining this sort of data with the tax records data, where we can observe people's income more frequently.
So
I'm sure there's some significant hurdles to that, but
yeah, sure.
Yeah. So can
Can
I kind of comment, because in part it's like kind of saying, where are we going with this? So, one of the things we thought was important in this first series of reports is to help to further the work that others have done around providing really strong baselines of where we are and what we need to start focusing on if we really want to take a meaningful approach towards really trying to work on poverty and reduce the more entrenched areas of poverty. So that was one of the things of, can we use some of these newer data sets that are underutilized data sets to help provide additional foundations? So now what we need to do is start kind of asking these deeper questions where we do try to tackle issues of causation. And then the other thing is that where this project is going, and so I'm going to say to folks, keep your eyes on this space, because part of our role that we will be doing in 2021 and into 2022 and beyond is really trying to create opportunities where we have shared data environments that encourages the linkage of the data sets when we can, but encourages the use of curated and understandable data to really try to tackle issues around poverty and disadvantage. So hopefully this has really kind of sparked everyone's interest and not only in wanting to know more, but also to roll up their sleeves and get involved with us.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a very ambitious and exciting agenda you've got laid out there. So unfortunately, we are now out of time. So let me thank Abigail and Maxim and also you, the audience, for participating in this event. The report for this colloquium will be sent to attendees after the event. And I also believe a link to it is being posted in the chat section in Zoom and next to the live stream on Slido as I speak. I hope you've enjoyed this, our final colloquium for 2020. And I look forward to seeing you at our future colloquia, which we are planning on beginning in February of next year. So please keep a lookout on our website for further information. But until then, thank you and goodbye.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.